Before the age of 16, I was the pampered young lady of the Bassett family. My parents adored me, my brother favored me, and I lived carefree. But when Zoe showed up with a DNA test, I found out that the nurse had switched the babies, and she was the real heiress, while I was just a bird in someone else's nest. Ding! Wisnovel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. I wanted to leave, but my biological parents had passed away, and Mrs. Bassett couldn't bear to see me become an orphan. So, she formally adopted me. My adoptive parents were kind to me, my brother didn't ignore me, and Zoe never made things difficult for me. I was grateful. However, later on, Zoe had a dispute with a fellow actor backstage at the set. During the argument, that person fell down the stairs and became a vegetable. There were no surveillance cameras at that time, but someone had to take responsibility for the crime, and I happened to be there at that moment, witnessed everything. My adoptive mother tearfully came to me, begging me to take the blame for Zoe. Zoe knelt in front of me, kowtowed, slapped herself, and apologized to me. The family cried in agony, so I nodded. I took the blame for her, went to jail, and endured hardships. Initially, the Bassett family would come to see me either feeling guilty or apologizing tearfully. But slowly, no one came to see me anymore. Once, during a prison event, the warden asked us about our plans after release. I thought for a long time before writing seriously. After release, I want to see my parents. When the inmate next to me saw it, she laughed at how simple my wish was. Your parents will definitely come to pick you up. How could you not see them? I smiled and didn't argue. But when I was actually released, no one came to pick me up. Only Mr. Bassett's assistant took me to the airport and gave me a large sum of money. He didn't say anything, but I understood everything. My parents didn't want me. The Bassett family had abandoned me. I didn't take that money, not because I wanted to pretend to be noble. I just didn't want to owe anything to the Bassett family anymore. They raised me for over 20 years, and I sat in jail for their daughter for 5 years. We were even. I rented a house, worked hard, and finally found a job that didn't mind my criminal record. But just after half a month, I was fired. I asked relentlessly, and the manager finally said hesitantly, "You've offended someone you shouldn't have." I was stunned, unable to say anything. Someone I shouldn't have offended. Besides the Bassett family, who else could it be? That day, I walked down the street with my bag, the light rain falling gently, the cool drops touching my face and body. Passing by the central square, Zoe Bassett's live broadcast was playing on the big screen. I stopped and looked up. On the stage, she was glamorous and charming, radiating her beauty freely. As the camera turned, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Bassett looking at her with tears of love in their eyes, as if they were beholding a rare treasure, full of affection. I don't know why, but I suddenly remembered the first visit in prison, where my adoptive mother, looking at my rapid weight loss, promised me with tears, "Sara, after you're released, Mom will take care of you for a lifetime. Mom loves you." But 2 years ago, the last time I saw her, her expression was filled only with faint guilt. She said, "Sara, Zoe is getting engaged to Chris Lowe. She really likes him. When you're released, can you leave here? So as not to be discovered by the Lowe family about the past." Chris Lowe, the heir of the Lowe family. There was a TV in prison, and I would occasionally hear about Zoe and Chris Lowe's deep love. It was said that Chris Lowe was a well-known playboy in the circle, but for Zoe, he had settled down, stepping into the entertainment industry he despised the most. He paved the way for her, providing her with connections, and personally presenting awards for her. Sometimes I would envy Zoe, envy her for being loved by her parents, favored by her boyfriend, achieving success in both career and love in just over 20 years. Unlike me, no parents, no career, no lover, and no one to love me. As for me marrying Chris Lowe, it was an accident. After being fired, I returned to my hometown and worked as a waitress in a restaurant. It was quite busy. I didn't know how he found out, but when he found me, I was serving beer to customers. A man drank too much, was unruly, and I frowned and slapped him. The man became furious and kicked me to the ground. The beer bottle and food spilled all over me. It was scalding. The man was still not satisfied, muttering and about to hit me, but the next moment, he fell silent. When I opened my eyes, I met a pair of eyes as bright as stars. Chris Lowe smirked, but lazily, showing little sincerity. "Sara Bassett, you're really here." I stood up, shook off the food debris on me, nodded, and tried to walk past him to leave. But just as I took a few steps, I heard his voice behind me. "Looking at how embarrassed you are. Do you want to marry me?" I turned back in astonishment. "Have you finally gone crazy?" "I'm serious." Chris Lowe glanced at me, his eyes dark and emotionless. Despite his serious tone, there was no emotion in his eyes. "To be honest with you, I was dumped by your sister, feeling upset, and you were forced into this state by the Bassett family. We can be considered victims together." The street lamp flickered twice, then declared its retirement. I couldn't see his face clearly. I could only hear him chuckle, a hint of red light emanating from his cigarette. "Anyway, you have nothing now. Marrying me, you won't lose anything. What are you afraid of?" I pondered, remained silent. He waited quietly, until a cool breeze blew by. I shivered subconsciously. Chris Lowe took off his custom-made coat and draped it over my shoulders. In an instant, the faint smell of tobacco from him filled my nostrils. divorce. I said, okay. When news of the marriage spread, everyone was shocked. They all said that Chris Lowe married me just to spite Zoe Bassett. At the wedding, when Chris Lowe said his vows, I noticed Zoe crying in the audience, her eyes red, and she left in a fit of emotions. I glanced at Chris, but he just smiled, not even looking at her, as if he had never loved Zoe before, as if he truly didn't care about Zoe anymore. After marriage, Chris treated me well. He arranged a secretary job for me, and we were always together. When I asked him why, he just frivolously smiled. I can't bear to leave a beauty like you at home, afraid that thieves might steal you away. If I lose a beauty like you, wouldn't that be a big loss? I laughed at his lack of seriousness, and couldn't be bothered to argue with him. After suffering so much during those years in prison, my body couldn't handle any more turmoil. A common cold or cough on me would turn into a serious illness. Chris hired various famous doctors to treat me, and I got better. By the sickbed, he held my hand, serious and sincere. Sara, I bought you. Your life belongs to me. You can't die before me. Childish words. But looking at his faintly bitter eyes, I eventually nodded. I didn't understand why he was so melancholic, but I had long learned not to ask, not to disturb. Okay, we will grow old together until death do us part. However, in the end, the one who didn't keep the promise was not me. It was Chris Lowe. Mrs. Lowe, Mr. Lowe passed away at 3 o'clock in the early morning due to a major car accident, despite the rescue efforts being ineffective. Please accept my condolences. I pushed open the door to the morgue, where Chris's parents were already crying uncontrollably. I looked at Chris, pale and lifeless, but could only think to myself. Fate favored him, granting him a family background, looks, and abilities beyond reach, yet why was he only given 34 years of life so sparingly? What a pity! I personally took care of Chris Lowe's funeral arrangements. After 5 years of marriage, many people never approved of our relationship. Zoe, out of jealousy, always waited to see us divorce. But no one expected that Chris would leave all his assets and shares to me. And Chris's parents had no objections. It's just that when they left, their backs were bent, lacking their former vitality. A week later, attorney Zach brought me the inheritance transfer documents, and before leaving, he handed me a recording pen. This is Mr. Lowe's belonging, already repaired. I believe you will need it, madam. Sara. In the recording pen, a man's cold voice, mixed with a hint of static, sounded hoarse. I married you not out of spite towards Zoe Bassett, but because I love you. I was stunned for a moment, but inside, I was calm, as if I had expected it long ago. Chris Lowe smiled lightly. Perhaps you have forgotten, but we have met before. You were the school's bright star, extremely intelligent, a teacher's favorite. My mentor often mentioned you, and after chatting with your teacher, he would grumble to me, Chris Lowe, I dislike you now. Stay away from me. He imitated his mentor's tone, appearing particularly endearing. I couldn't help but laugh subconsciously, but the next moment, I slowly reined it in. Chris continued speaking. I used to dislike you, but couldn't help but keep my eyes on you. I seemed a bit foolish, haha, but later, you were imprisoned for causing intentional harm. I didn't believe it. I had to find out. But unfortunately, the Bassett family had cleaned up all the clues, so I turned my attention to Zoe Bassett. So that's it. The widely acclaimed love story between Chris Lowe and Zoe Bassett was just an excuse for him to find out the truth behind my imprisonment. But Chris didn't expect Zoe to be so tight-lipped. Yet he eventually found some clues. Suddenly, I remembered that before we got married, Chris asked me excitedly one day, Sara, do you want revenge? No. I shook my head. I settled things with them. Years later, I finally understood that he probably had uncovered the truth that day. He investigated the truth for me. And for me, he kept the truth hidden. It was all because of me. Emotions in my eyes trembled violently. My whole body couldn't help but shake uncontrollably, tears falling drop by drop. But then again, my acting skills must be really great, so I fooled everyone, including you. You know, when I came to ask you to marry me, your expression and eyes were so cute. Forget it. I've said too much. In fact, I have always wanted to ask you. Chris cleared his throat. He was always cold and arrogant, but at this moment, his voice was unexpectedly tinged with a hint of youthful shyness. Sara, can you, also, like me a little? In this lifetime, I might not hear it. So, in the next lifetime, when I come to find you, you can tell me then. Amidst the sharp squeal of the brakes and the noisy screams of the crowd, I clearly heard his final words. He said, Sara, I really love you a lot. The end of his sentence even carried a hint of a smile. The emotions I had been suppressing suddenly collapsed at that moment. In the empty living room, there were lilies brought back by Chris a few days ago, still placed on the table. I had always liked lilies. He presented them to me as if they were treasures. Sara, do they smell nice? I specially picked them one by one. Sara, I'll be the one to change the flowers at home from now on. At that moment, the fine smile in his eyes, like gentle starlight, how could I say a single word of refusal? But the person who promised to grow old with me broke his promise. He left first, and took away the last hint of vitality of the lilies. The warm sun shone on my shoulders through the French windows. I reached out to touch it, but only felt coldness. Until today, I finally glimpsed the majestic yet hidden love that Chris Lowe had concealed beneath the ice. But it seems a bit too late. Attorney Zach saw Mrs. Lowe again again a week later. He came to get the inheritance transfer document. Having followed Chris Lowe for many years, he had also seen Mrs. Lowe many times. In his impression, Mrs. Lowe always carried herself gracefully, with a gentle smile, like a jade Buddha on a pedestal, observing the world's chaos with cold eyes. Not liking, not angry, not moved. Even when she learned of Chris Lowe's death, she just paused for a moment, not even shedding a tear. Chris Lowe was so good to her. Yet, she didn't shed a single tear for him. Attorney Zach had once felt that Chris Lowe was not valued in her heart. But this time, as soon as he entered the living room, Attorney Zach saw Mrs. Lowe holding several bunches of withered lilies, her face even paler than the falling snow. Upon seeing him, she didn't even offer a polite smile, just coldly stated, "Attorney Zach, donate his property to the orphanage. I don't want his money." No room for negotiation. As he was leaving, Attorney Zach couldn't help but turn back and ask, "Mrs. Lowe, did you ever like Mr. Lowe?" And Mrs. Lowe just smiled, without answering. Many years later, Mrs. Lowe had become a philanthropist widely reported by the media, supporting countless orphans. Attorney Zach saw her again at her sickbed. She was only 45, but her hair was completely white. At that moment, she looked out the window as if seeing someone, with a hint of girlish playfulness on her face. She said, "I liked you. I have always liked you. Sara, Mom begs you, please save your sister. She's so young. How can she go to jail? Sara, I really know I was wrong. I didn't mean to. I don't want to go to jail. I am a big star. If I go to jail, my whole life will be ruined." Waking up from darkness, I heard a noisy cry by my ear. My head was pounding, slowly opening my eyes, only to see everything clearly. Zoe was kneeling on the ground, crying uncontrollably. Mr. Bassett was comforting her with a pained expression. Mrs. Bassett was tightly holding my hand, tears streaming down her face, speaking with a hint of choking, but very seriously. "Sara, can you go to jail for your sister?" I looked at her in silence, as if encouraging her. Mrs. Bassett gritted her teeth. "Sara, there was no surveillance at the scene, only you and Zoe were there. The paparazzi only captured a figure from behind, nothing recognizable. As long as you admit that you accidentally pushed Aaron, the police won't find anything. Don't worry. After you go to jail, Mom will take care of everything for you, not letting you suffer. When you are released, the Bassett family will take care of you for the rest of your life." She said the same thing in my past life, but the shelf life of this promise was only a year. After the promise expired, I was kicked out of the single room, and because of my looks, I attracted some people's abuse and retaliation. Beatings, insults, even poisoning. Unbearable suffering. But no one saw me. Until I was hospitalized for nitrite poisoning in the food, Mrs. Bassett came to my bedside. That day, she looked down at me, with a hint of impatience in her expression. "After all, it's a prison, not a resort. It's unavoidable to suffer a bit. Sara, don't be so delicate. Zoe is going abroad on a business trip. I'm worried. I probably won't have time to come see you in the future." After that, I never saw her again. Looking at Mrs. Bassett's tearful face now, I believed that what she said at this moment was all sincere. But sincerity changes easily. Her guilt and self-blame towards me eventually turned into deeper fear as time passed. I gently pulled away from Mrs. Bassett's hand. "No." Mrs. Bassett was stunned, probably not expecting me, who had always been obedient like a lamb, to refuse her. But when I spoke again, it was serious and firm. "Mom, I thank you for raising me for 20 years, but I don't want to sacrifice my whole life for this. Call me selfish or a wolf in sheep's clothing, but I don't want to take the blame for her. I came back to life, not to repeat the same mistakes. In the last life, Chris saved me. This life, I want to save myself. And then, I want to walk to Chris's side with a clear conscience and dignity." My refusal made Mr. Bassett furious. He scolded me for not being grateful, enjoying the benefits of the Bassett family for so many years without giving anything in return. Mrs. Bassett and Zoe cried her heart out. Seeing that I wouldn't yield, they were worried I might run away. So, they locked me in a room. Only my brother Jalen Bassett remained silent throughout. Just like in the past life, Mrs. Bassett took away my phone, but little did she know, I had a spare one. I turned on the phone. The news of Aaron's unexpected serious injury, which led to her becoming a vegetable, had made it to the hot search. There were few clues. Only the paparazzi had taken a blurry back photo, and his words, Zoe and her sister had spent some time alone with Aaron. The police were probably on their way. I opened the spare phone and subconsciously dialed a phone number. Looking at the familiar numbers, I hesitated for a moment, but didn't make the call in the end. I don't know why. I was always a bit afraid. Afraid that the person on the other end wasn't the one I knew, and more afraid that if I woke up from this dream, I would never see him again. In the past life, after Chris's death, I paid his phone bill regularly. Late at night, I would text him, sometimes casually, sometimes complaining. I would always get a reply. "Sara, I'm here." It was his automatic reply, set by him before he died. How could this person be so despicable, clinging to my heart, making me unable to forget him for 10, 20, 30 years? I got up, pulled back the curtains, the warm sun shining through the window, falling on me with a slight chill. I saw the police outside, and the subtle glances from Mr. Bassett. Trembling, I finally sent a text message. "Chris Lowe, do you want to come and save me?" Mrs. Bassett wanted to stop me from coming coming out, then solidify the evidence against me. But I forcefully knocked on the door. Facing the police's inquiries, I ignored Mrs. Bassett's pleading eyes and replied, "In the past life, the successful conviction was because I admitted my guilt voluntarily, even erasing the evidence of my absence. But this life, I won't be so foolish. The past 20-some years of kindness had long been worn out in the previous life. Not hating was already my limit." And compared to my calmness, Zoe Bassett appeared more flustered and guilty. Who's right and who's wrong? Everyone knows. When Zoe was taken away, Mrs. Bassett cried hysterically. Mr. Bassett's face was dark, occasionally casting a glance at me as if I were his mortal enemy. He wished to tear me to pieces. The two followed Zoe as she left. I watched quietly, saying nothing. At that moment, Jalen Bassett walked up to me and said in a deep voice, "The Bassett family can't hold you anymore. Sara, you should leave." I looked up at him, pausing for a second at his red eyes. "Aren't you blaming me?" Jalen paused, not answering yes or no, just looking in the direction of the police car from afar. His tone was as light as a gust of wind. "Sara, you are also my sister." He had said the same thing in the previous life. He advised me not to take the blame. I asked him why. He lowered his eyes, his gaze like a gentle rain, gentle and compassionate. "You are also my sister." But this time, I decided to listen to him. Mrs. Bassett and Mr. Bassett probably hated me to the core now, and if I stayed, it would only add to their troubles. I said seriously, "Brother, take care of yourself." Jalen smirked, his voice hoarse. "Sara, live your life well." I packed my bags and walked out of the Bassett house. Looking ahead, the wind blew, swirling up fallen leaves. At this moment, the sunlight fell on me, warm and cozy. And then, a figure suddenly rushed up to me, sounding extremely flustered. "Sara, I'm here. Are you okay?"